welcome to the 7th session of this model called Public Policy Making, Poli 359. And this model is entitled Policy Environment, Actors, and Institutions. We begin by trying to understand what the environment of public policy is. The policy environment denotes the setting or context in which policy making takes place. The environment itself can be divided into two aspects. That is the internal environment and the external environment. The internal environmental factors include population size, age distribution, racial composition, spatial location, social structure, or the social system, economic system. These factors are internal factors because they come from within the borders of a sovereign state, and that's why we call them internal factors. Some of the internal environmental factors like demographic variables and social structure can somewhat be controlled. They can be controlled to ensure successful policy implementation. The external environment refers to the influences of the domestic policy-making process from outside the borders of a sovereign state. These factors include, for example, influences of other nations, international bodies like the UN, World Bank, IMF, ILO, etc. International happenings such as the recent Ebola crisis in Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia, climate change, globalization. Now, these factors affect us, but they come from outside our borders, and that is why we refer to them as external environmental factors. Now, let's look at authoritative policy making. There are a number of actors in the policy making arena, and these actors are divided into two categories. There are those we call authoritative policy makers, and authoritative policy makers are those who possess legal authority to engage in formulation of policy. The authoritative policy makers include the following: the executive, the legislature, the judiciary, and the bureaucracy. The authoritative policy makers are subdivided into two. We call them primary authoritative actors and secondary authoritative actors. Primary authoritative actors have direct constitutional authority to act. For example, the legislature does not have to depend on the governmental unit, other governmental units for authority to act. So Parliament of this country can act based on the mandate that has been given to it by the Constitution. And neither the executive or the judiciary can tell Parliament what it's supposed to do because its activities, its powers is already well spelled out in the Constitution. Now, secondary policymakers have delegated authority from these three arms of government to act. And now what this means is that the bureaucracy, even though it is an authoritative actor, it is called secondary authoritative actor because it does not draw its authority to make policy making directly from the Constitution. But the authority to act is delegated to it by the other three arms of government. That is the judiciary, the executive, and then the legislature. And that is why we call them secondary authoritative actors. Now, let's look at the role of the authoritative actors, and we take the role of the executive first. The executive branch of government is headed by the president, prime minister, or head of state, whatever he's called in any country. Here in Ghana, we refer to the head of the executive as the president. In Ghana, the executive is headed by the president. The president is a policy initiator in his own right. In foreign policy, such policy is a product of presidential actions and decisions. When the president travels, he makes a lot of policy arrangements, agreements with other countries, and these become policies of the land. These actions and decisions are based on either the president's constitutional authority or broad legislative delegation of power. Decisions to recognize foreign governments and to establish diplomatic relations with them are in the president's domain. So that is what the president can do. If he recognizes other countries and wants to deal with them or not deal with them, establish diplomatic relations with them, that is within his mandate. And when he does that, then he's acting on an aspect of policy. Treaties with other nations are made and entered into on behalf of Ghana by the president, although these may be subject to parliamentary approval. So if the president travels abroad and then signs any agreement, makes any agreement with any country or anything, then these agreements become policy of this land. Yet, the use of executive agreements, which have the same legal force as treaties, are used more frequently than treaties, meaning the president makes the decisions. Executive agreements have been used to end wars. Executive agreement can also be used to expand military bases in other countries, like the US is doing across many parts of the world. Limit possession of offensive weapons by the US and Russia or Iran. For more routine purposes such as tariff reduction, international trade policy for more than half of a century been primarily a construct of presidential action. Executive orders have become an accepted presidential prerogative. They are used in domestic policy making. For example, in the US recently, the president had issued executive orders to restrict nationals from certain countries, Muslim countries, entering the US. And that is an executive order. And even though it received a challenge from the court, he had to refine it and bring it and reintroduce it. And it seems to be working now. Many executive staff agencies, aides, and other advisors assist the president in his responsibility. So many people help him to do it. They are called presidential staffers, and they help the president in the execution of initiating and execution of policies in his domain. However, it is the president who ultimately makes the decisions. Several factors help shape and limit presidential decision making. These factors include the need to act in conformity with the Constitution. Now, what this means is that even though the president has the authority to initiate any policy proposal, he must bear in mind that he can only do that if that proposal is in conformity with the Constitution. The available resources. If you are making any policy, think about the resources that you are having as a country. If you make a big decision that cannot be supported by the funds that you have, then the policy will not see the light of day. Availability of time. President must understand that they have a presidential term limit, and they have a first 4-year term and a second 4-year term. So if you are thinking about a policy that will exceed more than 4 or 8 years, then you must know that it certainly cannot be implemented. Previous commitment. The other thing is that what previous commitments have you made to previous policies? And if you are going to abandon these policies and think about new ones, can you really do them? Available information. If you don't have all the information you need to act rationally, you may not be able to embark on policy. So president, in making decisions, must be sure that they have the full information to make the decisions that they are making. Otherwise, they will make a decision that will bring about suboptimal outcomes. Domestic policy decisions may also involve uncertainty, because we are going to make policy, but you don't know how the policy is going to play out. Is it going to succeed? Is it going to fail? Nobody really has the answer until the policy is played out. Political pressure and constraint. Sometimes you want to do something, but there is pressure from your political colleagues not to be able to do it. A recent example is President Zuma of South Africa sacking his deputy minister and then his substantive minister for finance. Now, it had a series of condemnation both from party members and from others within the wider society. Yet, the president was bent in implementing the policy. So, his party members have sought to isolate him. So, if you are making policy, be sure that the policy is also will be bought into by your political colleagues. Role of the legislature in policy making. The political task of law making. So the legislature is responsible for law making. Policy formulation is in a political system. So it is also responsible for formulating policy, representation of constituencies. So you must collect and collate constituency views and ventilate them in parliament. Oversight over executive action. So they are supposed to keep the executive in check, and then watch over what the executive is doing and make sure that the executive does not exceed its powers allocated to him in the Constitution. Most of the impact on policy in Ghana comes in the form of informal consultation between MPs and ministers. So whatever government wants to do, president wants to do, it first consult its majority in parliament to see if they buy into the idea, then they will be able to send the policy across because they know that it will pass the vote in parliament. Statement on the floor of parliament. So they come to make some statement on the floor of parliament, amendments of bills, because parliamentarians, when the president brings anything to parliament, they have the right to amend it, to reject it, or to approve it. So that is their work as parliamentarians. But what are the challenges of legislators in policy making? Legislators in developing countries like Ghana tend to be marginalized in the policy making process because of lack of experience in managing government, lack of experience in dealing with international bodies, low level of education compared to civil servants, limited resources, weak capacity of parliamentary service, and a high turnover among parliamentarians. Co-optation of legislature by the executive. And the last one is particularly important. Co-optation of legislature by the executive. In Ghana, the legislature and the executive are fused, and the president selects his ministers from parliament, majority of them from parliament. And therefore, if you want to be in the president's good book so that he can select you as a minister, then you need to toe the policy directive and buy into the policies the government wants. These policies may not be what you like as a person, as a legislator. They may not be the policies you like, but because you want to be in the good books of the president, you are forced to abide by what the president says. Now, the role of the judiciary in policy making. The judiciary has a number of functions. One, the exercise power of judicial review. When we talk about judicial review, we are talking about the power of the judiciary to really review the decisions of the executive or any other actor within the system. So the judiciary has to make sure that what the president does or what legislators do is in conformity with the Constitution. They should not do anything that violates any of the tenets of the Constitution. So if they do anything that violates the tenets of the Constitution, the judiciary can order them to reverse their decision or declare such a decision null and void, and they cannot be implemented. Two, decisions or judgment of the Supreme Court become public policies. Any decision that the Supreme Court makes, that decision becomes public policy, and whether the president or any other body within society likes it or not, it becomes policy. Interpret and decide the meaning of statutory provisions. So the Constitution is worded, and it is only the judiciary that has the right to give an interpretation of the Constitution. Any interpretation will not stand apart from the interpretation of the Supreme Court. So if lawyers interpret the Constitution in the way they want, because they want to win cases, it cannot stand if their interpretation is in conflict with the interpretation of the Supreme Court. So only the Supreme Court's interpretation becomes the interpretation of the law of the land. Play major role in informing economic policy. In many places, the judiciary is very important in economic policy. The court specifies what government cannot do. So in terms of economic policy, for example, they have been engaged in intertrust policy, they have been engaged in naturalization, they have been engaged in several policies, patent laws, company laws, and then how the game of the market is played out. The judiciary has been engaged in that. They have been engaged in trying to break up monopolies that try to create monopolies and try to make abnormal profit at the expense of the citizens. And therefore, the judiciary is very, very important in economic policy making. Now, the court specifies what governments can do, what government must do to meet legal or constitutional requirements. It is the court that must specify that. Several factors guarantee continued judicial involvement in policy making. The growing influence of government on people's life, the failure or refusal of a legislator to act on some problems, the dissatisfaction arising from legislative action, the willingness of the court to get involved, the increased litigiousness in segments of the population. Court's role in developing countries is circumscribed. Now, what all these mean is that if we leave the legislature and the executive alone, they may take actions that we don't want. They may take action that is in contravention of the Constitution. They may do something that is not legal. They may do something only to serve their interests but not serve our interests. And that is why the courts are there to keep them in check. But the court's role in developing countries are circumscribed. Because in developing countries, the courts are not completely independent and they are under the influence of the executive. And in some places, the executive can even sack the bench. And that is why, particularly in military dictatorship, and that is why the role of the executive, the judiciary in developing countries are much more circumscribed compared to mature democracies. Then what is the role of the bureaucracy in policy making? Bureaucrats do not only implement policy, but they develop it. The increased power and influence of administrative agencies is because of the following. One, the technicality and complexity of many policy matters. So many policy matters are complex, they are also technical, and then legislators or executive members, that is the politicians, may not be able to understand them to be able to make good decisions based on them. And therefore, they rely on the technocrats to be able to give them good advice in that regard. The need for continuing control. Because government come and grow and only the bureaucracy remains, each incoming government has to learn from the bureaucracy what policies and programs have worked in the past and what programs have failed in the past. Therefore, they can take clues and lessons from them so that they'll be able to implement good policies in the present time. Legislated lack of time and information. Because the parliaments do not have time and do not also have information, they rely significantly on the bureaucracies to provide them both with the information and then the expertise that they need to be able to work on policy issues. Agencies initiate policies for legislation in some nations. In some countries, many policy proposals come from the bureaucracies. They initiate it, they put it into writing, they put it into a concise and then consumable language by politicians. The bureaucracy is a repository of a wide range of skills and expertise, meaning that because they have been there for a very long time, they have been trained in that field, and because they have experienced many policies over and over again, they have come to develop a lot of expertise, and they will be able to offer very useful advice to politicians. Bureaucrats acquire insight into many problems. Administrative agencies have access to vast quantities of information on the different aspects of society. The long tenure of the bureaucracy gives it an edge over its nominal superiors and elected executive. However, the bureaucracy has been criticized for the power to frustrate the will of elected or executive. The entrained ideology of the state machine is inefficiency and its size. What this means is that even though the bureaucracy has all this power, sometimes they have used this power against politicians who are supposed to make the policies for the land. And they have used it if particularly they don't support the government, they can work to sabotage the government rather than help the government to succeed. The other problem of the bureaucracy is that they have been accused of inefficiency, not being able to improve upon their performance, and that they have also been accused of being too huge. Their size, their number is just too huge for the government budget. Role of interest group in policy making. Now, I've already said that policy making is made by two groups of people, authoritative actors and non-authoritative actors. The non-authoritative actors do not derive the mandate to make policy from the Constitution, but they add their voice to the making of policy. Why they are called non-authoritative actors is that they cannot participate at the decision-making stage with voice and vote. Even though they can criticize, even though they can add their voice, but they cannot vote. They cannot participate with voice and vote when it comes to decision. And that's why we call them non-authoritative actors. And one of the group of actors in the non-authoritative category is what we refer to as interest groups. What are the roles of these interest groups in public policy making? They perform an interest aggregation function, meaning if we are within society and we have different issues relating to different policy areas, then the interest group is the one that will bring us together and say, hey, this is the issues that you are discussing about. I can bring you together and give you a platform to air these views. They supply public officials with much information on the consequences of policy proposals. So they do research, they come out with the consequences of policies, and they have policy alternatives to what government have. And they can supply these alternatives to government. They are major sources of demand for public policy action. They pressurize government to take certain action on certain public policy problems. So they put pressure and they continue to hammer, and government is forced to attend to the issues that they have. They influence policy on specific subjects such as minimum wage, healthcare financing. Public interest group represent unrepresented interests. So the interests of people within society, many people are within society, but these people within society may have issues, may have problems, but they do not have a platform to air it. And interest groups are saying that we will give you that platform so that you can air your views. The amount of influence that interest groups have on decisions depend on the following. The size of the membership, because the larger the size, the larger the influence. The larger the size, the bigger your voice. And that's why we are saying that size is important. Monetary and other resources. If you have money, you can organize your activities, you can supply your participants with information and money to undertake these activities. So monetary resources is very, very important. Cohesiveness of the interest group. If there is conflict, if there is bickering, if there is disagreement among interest group members, they cannot function together as a whole. So for you to have unity, you need to have cohesiveness, you need to have agreement among yourself. Skills of the leadership. No group will perform very well if it hasn't got a strong and decisive and insightful leadership. So the leaders are very, very important in making sure that they carry the group through the tide so that they'll be able to achieve whatever they want. The social status of the interest group. Some interest groups are more influential and are more respected by government than other interest groups based on their numbers, based on their expertise. Particularly if you look at the group like the TUC, if they threaten any action, government is much more apt in responding to their agreement, their issues, compared to other groups within society that have no government members and that do not have following across all constituencies across the country. The presence or absence of competing organizations. If you are the only organization, then they will learn to hear you. If there are many organizations, then there are many organizations all giving their different issues, and government is forced to look at the different issues. But if you are only one, then you are the only one government is looking at. The attitude of public officials. Whether public officials will really tolerate what interest groups are doing. Will they buy into their decisions? Will they accept their proposals? And that is the issue that we are talking about here. The side of decision making in the political system, interest groups use increasingly the services of lobbyists to promote their ideas. Now, let's look at the role of political parties. And political parties are one of the non-authoritative actors. Political parties are interested in winning power. That is the main reason why political parties are formed. They are said to care more about power than about policy. Elections are contested more on the basis of one, constituency, service, media imagery, negative attacks on opponents. And these are the strategies political parties use to outwit their opponents. Elections are contested less on policy differences, through party discipline or otherwise legislatures influence through their voting. So it is said that, look, elections are not won just because you have very nice policies. Elections are won based on the activities that you have, based on your strategies, the strategies that you use to be able to outwit the opponent. That is the most important thing about political parties, and not just how nice your policies and programs are. So political parties have manifestos, and the manifestos are just blueprints of policy. Now, what a manifesto simply tells us is that, well, I'm a policy proposal in waiting. If the party is able to win power, then I'll use it as a blueprint for policy for the whole of the country. Once a political party wins power to govern, it converts its manifesto into policy initiatives. Political parties convert particular demands of interest groups into general policy initiatives. So the difference between a political party and an interest group is that whilst an interest group will stand on a single issue platform or a few issues, political parties aggregate all the issues, all the problems that society have into what he calls a manifesto. And the manifesto is the aggregate of all the issues, all the problems that this political party things confront society. In two-party system, policy packages need popular support than in multi-party systems. Then let's look at the role of think tanks in public policy making. Their studies and reports provide basic information and data on public policies. They develop alternatives and proposals for handling problems. They evaluate the effectiveness and consequences of public policies. Their personnel testify at legislative committee hearings. They communicate informally with public officials. They write articles for the open pages newspapers. Collectively, they add much substance to policy debates. So what think tanks really do is that they do research, they investigate, they do diligent work, their work is scientific, and they collect all this information and then present policy proposals which are alternative to what governments have. And if governments are wise and apt, they will take what think tanks tell them and add it to what they have so that they can enrich their policies. Much of these think tanks have policy biases. They also have distinct ideological leanings. The orientation of the Center for Democratic Governance in Ghana are widely regarded as liberal. Think tanks, in addition to their policy analysis activities, also engage in policy advocacy. Policy advocacy means that having a policy proposition and making sure that you come out, let the people buy into the policy proposal that you are having, let the government buy into the policy proposal, or try to pressurize government to see your side of the coin. That is what advocacy really means. Then think tanks provide expert and neutral information to policymakers. So if you are a think tank and you are biased in the information you give, if you lean to one political party, then the government will not learn to trust you. So you need to be neutral as a think tank to be able to provide advice that will be objective for government to be able to accept. However, the politicization of expertise has jeopardized the reputation of think tanks. So what is the role of the media in public policy making? They act as suppliers of and transmitters of information. So the media is usually referred to as the fourth estate, and they help to check all these other institutions of government and make sure that they perform their duties and responsibilities to the levels anticipated. They function as agenda setters by helping to determine what people think about. They shape attitudes regarding how to feel about and determine the severity of an issue or problem. They are a forum for public debate and discussion about policy problems. They are a watchdog or guardian of the public interest. They educate and mobilize the public to get engaged in public policy making. The media also help build peace and social consensus without which policy development is threatened. They serve as the conduit between the government and the governed. However, the media has been criticized for the following: the propensity for sleaze. And what I mean by propensity for sleaze is that these media organizations sometimes are biased, they don't report the truth, they are false, they report false information that does not really do the public any good. Their propensity for sensationalism, instead of focusing on the substance, they focus on the things that will put their paper in the limelight rather than focusing on the issue. Their propensity for superficiality, meaning that instead of concentrating on the most important things, they concentrate on things that are not very, very important. Their propensity to cover the policies of policy rather than the details of policy content. So they engage in politics of policy, meaning that only taking those issues that politicians and voters care, but not looking really on the details of the policy and what actually goes into the policy to make it a good one. That is what we mean. Now, what is the role of the individual citizen in public policy making? Now, the interests and desires of common citizens are consequential for public policies. Elections in democratic countries may be indirectly reinforce official responsibility to citizens' interests. Citizens have a right to be heard, and officials have duty to listen. Citizens' intellectual and protest activities contribute new ideas and direction to the policy process. Some citizens affect policy action through their political activism. So, as individuals, we are very, very useful in public policy because we can criticize, we can make proposals, we can refine policy, we can tell government what we want, we can tell government what we don't want, we can tell government what works, we can protest, we can criticize, and government is forced to refine its decisions. Citizens influence policy through the initiative. The initiative is a policy innovation dating from the progressive era. Progressive viewed the initiative along with referendum and recall as a way of transferring power from politicians to the people. An initiative arises when, on the basis of a petition signed by a specified number of voters, a policy proposal is placed on the ballot. Approval by a majority of those voting makes it a law. However, the initiative process frequently departs from the image of informed and activated citizens taking charge of policy making. In many cases, the process is dominated by powerful interest groups. They hire professional bodies to solicit the needed signature and wage expensive campaigns for and against the proposal. Due to inertia or indifference, most people do not take these opportunities to engage directly in shaping policy. Unfortunately, here in Ghana, we don't have the citizen initiative. And therefore, even if we don't want any policy or any proposal, we cannot gather signatures and force government to change its decision. We don't have that. Now, role of institutions in policy making. Institutions refer narrowly to actual structures or organizations of society and in the international system. Institutions are made up of two components, structures and principles. Structural aspects include membership, hierarchy, operational procedures of institutions. The principles are formal and informal rules, norms and conventions, ethical, ideological, and epistemic concerns. Institutions shape actors' behavior by conditioning their perception of their interests being realized. Institutions can be avoided, modified, or replaced without considerable effort. An institutional approach to policy making regards enduring institutions as the core of social and political life. The principles, capabilities, basic self-identities of individuals are conditions by institution. Now, in this model, we have tried to look at the environment, the actors, and the institutions of public policy making. We have said that the environment is the context in which public policy making takes place. And this environment is made up of factors that either actually facilitate or thwart public policy making. Then we have said that actors are divided into two categories, authoritative actors and non-authoritative actors. The authoritative actors are the three arms of government: judiciary, legislature, executive, in addition to the bureaucracy. Then non-authoritative actors is made up of all the various actors within society, for example, think tanks, interest groups, faith-based organizations, and others. These are those we call authoritative actors, and they do not participate with voice and vote during the decision-making stage. And we have said that individual citizens will also participate in public policy making. But at the end of the day, public policy must be done under the authority of government, even though we as non-authoritative actors also support government and contribute proposals. Thank you, and that is the end of the lecture.